You're just a burden now. That's what my daughter said to me, standing in my own kitchen 3 weeks after I buried her mother. She said it quiet, almost gentle, like she was doing me a favor by finally saying it out loud. I didn't answer her that night. I just nodded and went to bed. But I want you to remember that sentence, because by the time this story is over, it's going to cost her more than she ever imagined. My name is Walter Bregman. I'm 67 years old. I ran a precision tool and die shop outside Dayton, Ohio, for 41 years, and I always believed that if you worked hard and loved your family without conditions, they'd love you back the same way. I was wrong about that. Not about all of them, but about enough of them that it nearly broke me. There's a moment coming in this story, a specific moment in a conference room on the 4th floor of a building on Monument Avenue, that I will remember until the day I die. But I need to back up first, because you won't understand why that moment mattered unless you understand everything that came before it. I grew up in Kettering, right outside Dayton, the son of a machinist who worked the line at Delco for 34 years and came home every night with metal shavings in the cuffs of his pants. My father taught me 2 things that stuck with me my whole life. First, that a tool is only as good as the man who respects it. Second, that you take care of your own, no matter what it costs you. I started sweeping floors at a machine shop on Wagner Ford Road when I was 16 years old, and by the time I was 26, I'd saved enough, borrowed enough, and sweated enough to open Bregman Precision Tool on a half-acre lot off Webster Street in Dayton. That was 1984. I married Carol and Whitfield 2 years before that, in a small Methodist church on Far Hills Avenue, and she believed in that shop before it ever made a dime. We had one daughter, Renee, born in 1986, and for a long time, I thought we had built something that would outlast both of us in every good way. Carol passed on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 years ago, from a heart that had been tired for longer than either of us wanted to admit. She died in the bedroom of the house we'd owned since 1991, a modest brick colonial on Fenwick Road in a neighborhood called Southmore Park, the kind of street where the same families had lived for 30 years and you knew everyone's dog by name. I was holding her hand when it happened. I want to tell you that grief is loud. It isn't. Grief is quiet. It's a coffee mug still sitting in the drying rack that you can't bring yourself to put away because it was the last one she used. It's a coat still hanging by the back door in June. That's the kind of quiet I lived in for the first year after Carol died, and I want you to hold on to that image, because it matters for what comes next. Renee is 39 now. She's married to a man named Craig Holt, an insurance adjuster who I never disliked exactly, but never fully trusted either. There was always something calculating behind his handshake, the way he sized up a room before he ever said a word in it. They live about 11 miles from me, out in a newer development in Washington Township, a 4-bedroom house with a 3-car garage and a mortgage I happen to know, from an offhand comment Craig made 2 Thanksgivings ago, that stretched them thinner than either of them ever admitted out loud. They have one daughter, my granddaughter, Lily, who was 15 at the time all of this started, and Lily is the reason any of what follows is bearable to tell. For the first 8 months after Carol died, Renee came around a lot. She'd bring a casserole, sit with me on Sunday afternoons, ask if I was eating enough, ask if I was sleeping. I appreciated it. I want to be fair here, because people ask me that, whether I'm being fair to my own daughter in telling this story, and I am trying to be. Grief does strange things to people, and I think for a while, Renee's visits were real. But somewhere around month 9, the visits started having an agenda underneath them that I didn't clock at first. She'd bring up the house, how big it was for one man, how the stairs would be a problem eventually, with my knees the way they were, how Sherwood Village, an assisted living community out past the Dayton Mall on Miamisburg Centerville Road, had a lovely 2-bedroom unit opening up, and wouldn't it be nice to simplify? I want you to notice something, because I noticed it too, eventually, even though it took me longer than it should have. Every single one of those conversations happened at my kitchen table, on my back porch, in my living room. Never anywhere Craig couldn't hear. Never anywhere Craig wasn't somehow already involved in the planning. By month 11, the conversations had a different tone entirely. Renee stopped asking if I was eating enough and started asking about my finances. Casual questions at first. Did I still have the retirement account from the shop? Had I updated my will since Mom passed? Did I know what my house was worth in this market? Because Craig had a friend at a real estate office on Far Hills who could run comps anytime I wanted. I told her I was fine, that Carol and I had planned carefully, and that I didn't need to think about any of that yet. She'd nod and change the subject, but the questions always came back a few weeks later, dressed up a little differently. Here's what Renee did not know. What none of them knew, not Renee, not Craig, not a single soul outside of one attorney and one accountant. 22 years ago, back in 2002, I developed a modified carbide insert design for a specific class of CNC lathe tooling, something that solved a chatter problem that had been costing manufacturers real money on stainless steel work. I patented it quietly, kept licensing it out in small deals through the 2000s, nothing dramatic. But in the fall of 2021, a larger manufacturing conglomerate out of Cincinnati, a company called Vantage Industrial Group, came to me wanting to buy the patent outright, along with 2 related designs I'd developed alongside it. I negotiated for 8 months. I had a good attorney, a sharp one, and by the time the ink dried in June of 2022, the total deal, patent purchase, plus a 5-year consulting retainer I never intended to use, came to $2,340,000. I never told Renee. I never told Craig. I didn't tell them because Carol and I had a rule in our marriage, one we made back in the lean years of the 80s when the shop nearly went under twice, that money conversations inside the family stay private until they need to be public, because money changes how people look at you, and we'd seen it happen to friends of ours. I kept that rule after she died. I moved the money, after taxes and after the attorney's fee, into a private investment account, and I sat on it. I didn't buy a boat. I didn't buy a new truck. I kept driving my 2014 Silverado with 161,000 miles on it, and I kept living in the house on Fenwick Road like nothing had changed, because nothing had, except that I now had options nobody in my family knew about. I didn't know it yet, but that silence was about to become the only thing standing between me and losing everything I'd built. The pressure got worse in the spring, about 14 months after Carol passed. Renee started showing up unannounced, which she never used to do, always with a reason. She needed to borrow the ladder. She wanted to check on the gutters. She was in the neighborhood, and every single visit, somewhere in the conversation, Sherwood Village would come up again, or the stairs would come up again, or Dad, you scared me. I called 3 times yesterday, and you didn't pick up would come up, even though I'd been in the garage with the radio on, same as always. Then came the night in the kitchen. It was a Thursday, late April, and I'd made myself a plate of pork chops and green beans, nothing fancy, and Renee had stopped by to drop off a prescription refill she'd picked up for me from the CVS on Wilmington Pike. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen while I ate, arms crossed, and she watched me for a long moment before she said it. Dad, I need you to really hear me on this. You're not getting any younger, and I love you, but I can't keep doing this. I've got Lily. I've got work. I've got Craig's mother's health too now. You're just a burden now, and I think it's time we talk seriously about Sherwood Village. You're just a burden now. She said it soft. She said it like a woman who'd rehearsed it, who believed she was being the responsible one, the practical one. I set my fork down. I didn't argue with her that night. I told her I'd think about it, and she left, and I sat at that table for a long time after she was gone, looking at the empty chair across from me where Carol used to sit, and I thought about 41 years of getting up at 5:30 in the morning to open that shop, about paying for Renee's braces and her prom dress, and 2 years of a private college in Columbus before she transferred somewhere cheaper, about every Christmas, every birthday, every single time she'd ever needed anything. I want to be clear about something, because it matters. I wasn't angry that night. Not yet. I was something closer to confused. The kind of confused that comes right before you start paying very close attention to things you'd been letting slide. And that's exactly what I started doing. The first thing I noticed, about 2 weeks later, was a manila folder on the passenger seat of Craig's car when he came by to pick up a lawnmower part he'd borrowed. I wasn't snooping. It was sitting right there, visible through the window while I walked him out. The folder had a sticky note on it, and I have good eyes even at 67, better than either of them gave me credit for, and the sticky note said, in Renee's handwriting, ask Marjorie about guardianship timeline, Dad. Guardianship. Not assisted living. Guardianship. I didn't say anything to Craig. I shook his hand, told him to drive safe, and went back inside, and I stood in my own front hallway with my heart going harder than it should have, thinking about that word. I'm not a lawyer, but I know enough to know that guardianship isn't about picking out a nice apartment near the Dayton Mall. Guardianship is a legal proceeding. Guardianship is what happens when a family goes to a probate court and asks a judge to declare a person incompetent to manage their own affairs, and then hands that authority to someone else. They were building a case that I couldn't take care of myself. I called an old friend of mine that same night, a man named Roy Castellano, who I'd known since we were both apprentice machinists in our 20s, back before he left the trade for law school at the University of Dayton. Roy had done contract work for the shop for years, but I'd never once used him for anything personal. I called him at 9:40 that night, and I said, "Roy, I need you to point me toward an elder law attorney, somebody sharp, somebody who isn't going to take it easy on my family because they think that's the nice thing to do." Roy didn't ask a lot of questions that night. He just said, "Walt, that doesn't sound like you. What's going on?" And I told him. All of it. The Sherwood Village conversations, the burden comment, the folder on the car seat. Roy went quiet for a second, and then he said something I've thought about 100 times since. He said, "Walt, you built that whole shop out of nothing but stubbornness and good judgment. Don't let anybody tell you those two things left you just because your wife did." The next morning, Roy gave me a name. Diane Marsh, an elder law and estate attorney with an office on Monument Avenue downtown, 4th floor, a woman Roy described as somebody who'd eat a guardianship petition for breakfast if it wasn't built right. I called her office that same day and had an appointment 2 days later. I want you to sit with something for a second, the way I had to sit with it. I hadn't done anything wrong. I wasn't confused. I wasn't forgetting appointments or leaving the stove on or wandering off in a parking lot. I was a 67-year-old man in good health, a little arthritis in my knees, a little high blood pressure managed with a pill every morning, nothing more than that. And my own daughter was quietly gathering the paperwork to have a court strip me of my legal independence. Diane Marsh's office looked exactly like what you'd expect from a woman who Roy trusted. No frills, good bones, a wall of law books that actually looked red rather than decorative. She was maybe 55, silver hair cut close, reading glasses pushed up on her head the entire time we talked. I sat down across from her desk and told her everything, start to finish, and when I got to the part about the sticky note, she stopped writing and looked up at me directly. "Mr. Bregman," she said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, because it changes how we build this. Does your daughter or her husband know about the Vantage Industrial Settlement?" "No," I said. "Nobody knows. Not even my accountant's staff, just him directly." She nodded slowly, the way a woman nods when a plan is starting to take shape behind her eyes. "That's good," she said. "That's very good. Because if they're building toward a guardianship petition, and I believe based on what you're describing that they are, the single biggest risk to you isn't losing your house or losing your independence, though those are real risks. The biggest risk is that if a court grants guardianship over your financial affairs before that trust is properly protected, your son-in-law's name is on record with an insurance company, which means he understands liability and paperwork better than the average person walking through my door. That's not a coincidence, Mr. Bregman. That's a man who knows exactly what kind of document he's trying to build." I sat in that office for 2 hours. Diane laid out exactly how the process works. In Ohio, to establish a guardianship, someone has to file a petition with the probate court, and the court appoints an investigator, sometimes orders a medical and psychological evaluation, and eventually holds a hearing. It's not fast, and it's not automatic, but if the family builds a strong enough paper trail beforehand, statements about missed appointments, notes about confusion, testimony from neighbors, it can move quicker than you'd think, and a judge who's overworked and sees 15 of these cases a week doesn't always dig as deep as they should. "Here's what we're going to do," Diane said. "We're going to make sure that by the time anyone files anything, there is nothing left for a court to take control of, because it will already be locked, structured, and completely out of reach. And we're going to do it quietly, the same way you kept that settlement quiet for 3 years. I didn't know it yet, sitting in that office on Monument Avenue, just how much quiet planning it was going to take, or how close I was going to come to losing more than money before this was over. Over the next 6 weeks, I lived 2 completely different lives, and I want you to understand how strange that felt, because I'd never been a man who kept secrets from his own family before. In one life, I was the Walt that Renee and Craig saw. Slower on the stairs than I used to be, sure, agreeable about the doctor's appointments, mild about the Sherwood Village conversations, letting Renee believe she was wearing me down. I even let her set up an appointment with a real estate agent to walk through the house and give me a valuation, which I sat through politely, nodding along, asking a few softball questions about the market. In the other life, I was working with Diane Marsh's office 3, sometimes 4 times a week. We restructured the investment account from the Vantage settlement into an irrevocable trust, which meant that once it was signed and funded, not even I could easily undo it, let alone a court-appointed guardian acting on my behalf. Diane structured it as what she called a spendthrift-protected trust with a named independent trustee, a financial fiduciary out of Cincinnati named Patrice Odell, who had no personal relationship with anyone in my family and therefore no motive to bend. We also did something I hadn't expected to need. Diane insisted I get a full, independent cognitive and physical evaluation, done through a geriatric specialist unaffiliated with my regular doctor, a woman named Dr. Anisha Patel out of Miami Valley Hospital, purely so that if anyone ever did try to argue I was incompetent, there would be a clean, recent, professionally documented record proving otherwise. I sat through 2 hours of memory tests, reasoning tests, questions about dates and current events and simple math, and Dr. Patel told me afterward, plainly, that my cognitive function was, in her words, well within normal range for your age, if not slightly above it. I kept that report in a fireproof lockbox in my garage, next to the title to my truck. The final piece was the one that took the longest, and the one that mattered most. I had my will completely rewritten. Here's where I need to tell you about Lily, because everything I did from that point forward, I did with her in mind as much as myself. My granddaughter Lily was 15 that spring, a sophomore at Centerville High School, and from the time she could walk, she had been the one person in that family who never once treated me like an obligation. When Carol was in her final months, sick and tired and scared, it was Lily who came over 3 afternoons a week after school, sat on the edge of the bed, and read to her grandmother out of whatever paperback happened to be on the nightstand. It was Lily who learned to make Carol's chicken and rice recipe from a card in the kitchen drawer, just so she could bring me a container of it on nights I clearly hadn't cooked. It was Lily, not Renee, not Craig, who called me every single Sunday evening at 6 o'clock, no matter what else was going on in her life, just to talk about nothing in particular. School, a boy she liked, a book she was reading for English class. She never once asked me about money. She never once asked me about the house. She showed up because she wanted to be there, and at 15 years old, she had already figured out something her own mother hadn't, which is that love that keeps score isn't love at all. I didn't tell Lily about the trust. I didn't tell her about Diane Marsh, or the guardianship folder, or any of it. She was 15. I wasn't going to hand a teenager that kind of weight to carry. But I watched her that spring, watched the way she'd show up on a Tuesday with a container of soup because I'd mentioned offhand that I had a cold, watched the way she'd sit at my kitchen table doing her algebra homework just so I wouldn't be eating dinner alone, and I made a decision that I never once second-guessed for the rest of this story. Welcome back to Sweet Family Revenge. If you're just joining us, grab your coffee, get comfortable, because this story is about to take a turn you won't see coming. If you've been with me since the beginning, you already know what kind of man Walter Bregman is, and you're about to find out exactly what kind of man Craig Holt turned out to be. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button, because there's a lot more of this story left. The guardianship petition, when it finally got filed, was worse than even Diane and I had prepared for. It happened on a Wednesday morning in early July. I found out about it because Diane's office had, weeks earlier, filed what's called a notice of appearance with the Montgomery County Probate Court on my behalf, purely as a precaution, which meant her office got flagged the moment anything with my name on it hit the docket. Diane called me herself, not an assistant, at 11:15 that morning. Walt, she said they filed. This morning. Renee Bregman Holt, petitioner, requesting appointment as guardian of person and estate for Walter James Bregman. The petition alleges early-stage cognitive decline, difficulty managing complex financial matters, and what it calls a pattern of isolation and self-neglect since the death of your wife. I sat down hard in my kitchen chair when she said that. Self-neglect. My own daughter had written, or had a lawyer write, that I was neglecting myself. There's something else, Diane said. The petition includes a supporting affidavit from Craig. And Walt, I need you to brace yourself for this part. It also includes a supporting statement, and signed but attributed, from someone at your shop. That one landed harder than anything else. Because I had already sold Bregman Precision 3 years earlier, in 2021, to my longtime shop foreman and closest friend in that business, a man named Desmond Ojo, who'd worked for me for 19 years and who I trusted more than almost anyone outside my own family. I called Desmond that same afternoon, and he told me, flatly furious on my behalf, that Craig had come by the shop twice in the past 2 months, introducing himself as just checking in on Walt's behalf, asking Desmond and a couple of the younger machinists casual questions about whether I'd seemed sharp during my occasional visits, whether I ever repeated myself, whether I seemed confused about the old equipment. Desmond told him, both times, that I was sharper than half the guys on the floor, but apparently that hadn't stopped Craig from including a vague, second-hand version of that conversation in the court filing anyway. I didn't know it yet, but that petition was about to force the exact confrontation Diane and I had spent 6 weeks quietly preparing for. And it was going to happen faster than either of us expected. The court scheduled a preliminary hearing for late August, but Diane insisted we request a face-to-face meeting first, outside the courtroom, what she called a settlement conference, where both sides and their attorneys would sit down before things escalated into a full contested hearing with a court-appointed investigator crawling through my finances and my medical history in public record. Renee's attorney, a younger man named Tobias Reyes out of a firm in Beaver Creek, agreed to it, probably, Diane guessed, because Craig and Renee as soon died fold under the pressure of formal paperwork the same way I'd been folding, quietly, at the kitchen table for over a year. They had no idea what was waiting for them. The meeting was set for a Tuesday morning in late July, on the 4th floor of the building on Monument Avenue where Diane's office sat, in a conference room with a long oak table and a view out over the Great Miami River. I arrived 20 minutes early, the way I always arrived early to everything in my working life, and Diane met me in the lobby with a leather folder under her arm and a look on her face that told me she was ready. Renee arrived with Craig at exactly 9:58, 2 minutes before the meeting, wearing the kind of navy blazer she used to wear to parent-teacher conferences when she wanted to look serious. Craig had a folder of his own, thicker than Diane's, and Tobias Reyes walked in a step behind them, shaking Diane's hand with the practiced politeness of two attorneys who'd probably been across the table from each other before. Renee looked at me when she sat down, and for just a second, something flickered across her face that might have been guilt, or might have just been nerves. "Dad," she said, "I want you to know, this isn't personal. We just want what's best for you." I didn't say anything yet. I let her finish laying out her case, the way Diane had coached me to. Renee talked about the stairs, about a missed dentist appointment 8 months earlier that I'd genuinely just forgotten, about how isolated I'd become since Carol died, about how she worried every single day about me living alone in that house. Craig chimed in with his own additions, dry and clinical, the way he probably talked to claims adjusters all day. He mentioned the shop visit, softened now into something about wanting to understand Walt's day-to-day cognitive function in a familiar setting. He mentioned my finances, said they were concerned about mismanagement risk given the complexity of retirement assets at this stage of life. I want you to notice something. Not once, in 20 minutes of talking, did either of them ask me a single direct question. Not once did they turn to me and say, "Dad, how are you really doing?" It was a presentation, built for a judge who wasn't even in the room yet. When they finally finished, Tobias Reyes slid a document across the table, a proposed consent agreement, essentially asking me to voluntarily agree to a limited guardianship over my financial affairs, with Renee named as guardian, to avoid the stress of a contested hearing. Diane didn't touch the document. She looked at Tobias, then at Renee, then at Craig, and she said, "Before we discuss any consent agreement, I'd like to introduce some materials into this conversation that I believe change the entire framework of what we're discussing here today." She opened her folder. The first thing she slid across the table was Dr. Patel's evaluation, dated 6 weeks earlier, showing cognitive function well within normal range. Renee's face didn't move much at that one. Craig's jaw tightened slightly. The second thing she slid across was a letter from Desmond Ojo, notarized, describing in detail both of Craig's visits to the shop, including the specific dates, and stating plainly that at no point had he ever expressed or implied any concern about my mental sharpness, and that he considered the characterization in the court filing to be, in his words, a deliberate misrepresentation of a private conversation. Craig's face went a shade paler at that one. Renee glanced at him, and I watched something pass between them, the first real crack I'd seen since they'd walked in. Then Diane slid across the third document, And this is the moment I told you about at the very beginning of this story. The moment on the fourth floor of that building on Monument Avenue that I will remember for the rest of my life. It was a single-page summary from Patrice O'Dell, the independent trustee, outlining the structure of the Bregman Family Irrevocable Trust, funded in the amount of $2,340,000, established and fully executed 11 weeks earlier, with an independent professional trustee, immune from any future guardianship or conservatorship order under Ohio law, because the assets were no longer legally mine to manage in the first place. I no longer had direct control over that money. Nobody did, except Patrice, acting according to the terms I'd already set. Renee read it twice. I watched her eyes move across that page a second time, slower, like she was hoping the numbers would rearrange themselves into something smaller, something that made more sense with the version of her father she'd built her whole case around. $2 million, she said quietly. Not a question, just the number, said out loud, like she needed to hear it in her own voice to believe it. $2,340,000, Diane said evenly. From a patent sale to Vantage Industrial Group in 2022. Your father never touched a dime of it for himself. It's been sitting in a properly managed account this entire time. Craig's voice came out tight. Walt, why wouldn't you tell us this? We could have. This changes everything about the retirement planning conversation we were trying to have with you. I looked at my son-in-law for a long moment before I answered. You weren't trying to have a retirement planning conversation with me, Craig, I said. My voice was calm. I want to be clear about that, because I know what these stories usually sound like. Somebody standing up and shouting, throwing the truth in someone's face like a slap. That's not what happened. I never raised my voice once in that entire meeting. You were trying to have a guardianship conversation. There's a difference, and you know there's a difference, because you work in insurance, and you understand paperwork better than almost anyone I know. Renee's eyes were wet now. Dad, we thought you were struggling. We really did. I wasn't trying to steal from you. I believe that you believe that, I said, and I meant it, because I did believe there was a version of Renee, somewhere underneath all of this, who had convinced herself that filing a guardianship petition against her own father was an act of love rather than an act of control. But belief doesn't undo what you did. You had a folder with the word guardianship written on it in your own handwriting before you ever sat me down for an honest conversation about how I was doing. You went to my shop and asked my employees to describe me as confused. You had your husband write a sworn statement to a court claiming I couldn't manage my own life, without once, not one single time in 14 months, sitting across from me and simply asking. The room was quiet for a long moment. Tobias Reyes cleared his throat and said something about withdrawing the petition given the new information, and Craig started to argue about the timeline, about how they'd already invested legal fees, and I let Diane handle the procedural back and forth for a while, because that part wasn't really the point anymore. The point had already landed. I didn't know it yet, sitting in that conference room, just how much further this was about to go, because Diane wasn't finished. She had one more document in that folder. She slid it across the table last, and it was a copy of my newly executed last will and testament, dated 3 weeks prior, along with the trust distribution schedule. I want to walk you through this, Diane said, because I think it's important that everyone understands exactly where things stand, so there's no confusion going forward. The Bregman Family Irrevocable Trust, she explained, was structured with 2 primary beneficiaries. The first was a fully funded education and future trust for Lily Holt, my granddaughter, in the amount of $600,000, to be released in structured distributions for college, professional training, or a first home purchase, managed entirely independently of her parents, accessible only through Patrice O'Dell's office once Lily turned 18, with no ability for Renee or Craig to access, borrow against, or influence those funds in any way. The second was a smaller but permanent fund, $150,000, established in the name of Desmond Ojo, not as compensation for anything, I made clear, but as recognition of 19 years of loyalty and honesty, the kind of honesty that had just, quite literally, protected me in that very room. The remainder of the trust, roughly $1,590,000, was structured to fund my own long-term care, on my own terms, in my own home for as long as medically reasonable, with any excess, upon my death, split between a scholarship fund at the University of Dayton's engineering program, named in Carol's memory, and a final modest distribution to Renee herself. $25,000, structured not as a punishment, Diane clarified, but as what she called a closed door with a small, deliberate gap left in it. Renee did not receive guardianship. Renee did not receive access to the trust. Renee, in fact, received a formal notice, drafted that same week and delivered the following Monday, informing her that going forward, any future communication regarding my finances, my medical decisions, or my living arrangements would go exclusively through Diane Marsh's office, and that I was, effective immediately, revoking the healthcare power of attorney I had previously listed her under, replacing it with Desmond Ojo, a decision I made not out of spite, but because I needed, for the first time in over a year, to know that the person legally empowered to make decisions on my behalf, if I was ever truly unable to make them myself, was someone who had never once looked at me and calculated what I was worth. I want to pause here, because I know some of you are waiting for the moment I finally raised my voice, finally said the thing that made Renee cry in front of everyone, finally got my dramatic confrontation. That's not what happened, and I think that's important. The most powerful thing I did in that entire conference room was stay calm. I let the paperwork say what I couldn't bring myself to shout. Diane told me once, early on, that the families who lose these fights are usually the families who get loud first. I never got loud. Not once. Craig tried, near the end, to argue that the trust structure was somehow improper, that I'd been coached by an attorney to hide assets from my own family, and Diane simply reminded him, in that same even, unhurried voice she'd used the entire meeting, that every document had been executed with an independent cognitive evaluation on file, dated weeks before any guardianship petition existed, and that if he wanted to pursue that argument in front of a judge, she would be happy to introduce Dr. Patel's full report, along with Desmond's notarized letter, and the timeline of exactly when Craig had visited that shop asking leading questions about my mental state. Craig didn't say anything else after that. The meeting ended a little after noon. Renee stood up slowly, gathered her things, and looked at me one more time before she left. "I'm still your daughter," she said quietly. "You are," I said, "and I'm still your father. That's not something a piece of paper changes. But trust isn't the same thing as blood, Renee. I gave you every reason in the world to trust me, and you decided to have a lawyer describe me as neglecting myself instead of picking up the phone and asking how I was really doing. That's the part one need you to sit with, not the money." She didn't say anything back. She and Craig left the conference room together, and I heard their footsteps fade down the hallway toward the elevator, and I sat there for a moment with Diane, looking out at the river through that fourth-floor window, and I felt something I hadn't felt in over a year. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter than that. Something closer to solid ground. The weeks that followed were slower, and honestly, that's when the real story finished writing itself, in the small, ordinary moments rather than the courtroom drama. Renee did not contest the withdrawal of the petition. Tobias Reyes formally filed a dismissal with the Montgomery County Probate Court 11 days after that meeting, and as far as the legal system was concerned, the matter was closed. But something between Renee and me stayed different for a long time afterward. She didn't call as often. When she did call, the conversations were shorter, more careful, like two people picking their way across ice they didn't fully trust. I won't pretend that didn't hurt. She's my daughter. I raised her. I taught her to ride a bike in the driveway of the house on Fenwick Road. I walked her down the aisle at her wedding to Craig. And now I was a man who kept a fireproof lockbox in his garage because he no longer fully trusted that same daughter with the truth about his own finances. That's not a small thing to carry, even when you know you did the right thing. But Lily didn't know about any of it for the first few months. Not the trust, not the petition, not any of it. Her Sunday calls kept coming. 6 p.m., same as always, and I didn't tell her, because I didn't want her carrying that weight during her sophomore year of high school. But in October, 5 months after the conference room meeting, Renee sat Lily down and told her, in her own words, about what had happened, about the guardianship petition, about the trust, about all of it. I don't know exactly what was said in that conversation, because I wasn't there, and I never asked Lily to relitigate it for me. But I know that Lily called me that same night, not at 6 o'clock, but at almost 9:30, and when I picked up, she was crying. "Grandpa," she said, "why didn't you tell me?" "Because it wasn't your fight, sweetheart," I said. "You were 15 years old. Your job was to bring me soup and do your algebra homework at my kitchen table, not carry around what your parents were trying to do." She was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and then she said something I've thought about often since. "I would have stopped them if I knew," she said. "I would have told them how wrong it was." "I know you would have," I told her. "That's exactly why I didn't want you in the middle of it. But I want you to know something else, Lily, and I need you to really hear this part. None of what I did was about punishing your mom and dad. Some of it was. I won't lie to you about that. But most of it, the biggest part of it, was about you. Every single time you showed up on a Tuesday with soup, every Sunday call, every single afternoon you spent reading to your grandmother when she was sick, you were the only person in this family who never once asked me for anything. So when it came time to decide who deserved to be protected, that wasn't a hard decision for me to make. Lily is 17 now, a senior, and she still calls every Sunday at 6 o'clock. She still comes by on Tuesdays, though now it's usually with her learner's permit driving skills instead of soup, practicing three-point turns in my empty driveway on Fenwick Road while I sit on the porch and pretend I'm not nervous. She knows about the education trust now, knows it's there waiting for her, structured so carefully that no one, not her parents, not a future guardianship petition, not anyone, can ever touch it before she's ready to use it for exactly what it's meant for. And I want to be clear, because people ask me this too, I didn't tell her about the money to buy her loyalty. She'd already given me that loyalty for 2 full years before I ever wrote a single word of that trust document. The money was never the point. The money was just how I made sure her loyalty was never punished the way mine almost was. Desmond Ojo still runs Bregman Precision, still does good, honest work out of that shop on Webster Street. And when Diane's office called him to let him know about the trust distribution I'd set up in his name, he called me himself, his voice rough on the phone, and said, "Walt, I didn't do anything but tell the truth." "That's exactly the point, Desmond," I told him. "Do you have any idea how rare that turned out to be this year? Renee and I have found something closer to peace over the past several months, though I won't pretend it looks like it did before Carol died. We have dinner together maybe once a month now, always somewhere neutral, a diner on Far Hills Avenue we both used to go to when Renee was a kid. Craig doesn't usually come. I think, on some level, he knows there isn't much left to repair between us, and I think he's right about that. Renee, though, has started asking real questions again, the kind she used to ask before grief and financial anxiety, and whatever fear was driving Craig turned her into someone I didn't fully recognize for a year and a half. She asked me last month, over a plate of eggs and a cup of coffee, whether I was lonely in that house on Fenwick Road, and for the first time in a long time, I believe she was asking because she wanted to know the answer, not because she was building a file. I told her the truth. I told her I was lonely sometimes, the way any man is lonely after 40 years of marriage ends with an empty side of the bed. But I told her I wasn't neglected, and I wasn't a burden, and I never had been, and that the difference between those two things had cost us both more than either of us wanted to admit. I still live in the house on Fenwick Road. I still drive the Silverado, though it's up to 168,000 miles now. I still keep Carol's coat by the back door, and I've stopped feeling strange about that. Some things you don't put away. Some things you just learn to live alongside. I think about that sentence a lot. You're just a burden now. I understand now that Renee said it out of fear more than cruelty. Fear about money. Fear about her own future. Fear that Craig had planted and watered until it grew into something neither of them fully controlled anymore. That doesn't excuse it, but it helps me understand it, and understanding it is the only way I've found to keep loving my daughter while still holding the line on what happened. If there's a lesson in all of this, and I've had a lot of quiet evenings on that back porch to think about what it is, I think it's this. The people who truly love you rarely announce it with paperwork or performance. They announce it with soup on a Tuesday, with a Sunday phone call that never gets missed, with a foreman who tells the truth even when a lie would have been easier and might have even seemed kinder in the moment. And the people who are only calculating your worth, they'll dress it up as concern for as long as they think they need to. But eventually, if you pay close enough attention, you'll see the folder on the car seat before they ever mean for you to see it. I gave my daughter everything I had for 39 years. I never once asked what it cost me. And when the day finally came that she decided I wasn't worth anything more than a signature on a guardianship form, I didn't shout, and I didn't beg. I simply made sure that when the truth finally sat down at that table on Monument Avenue, it was strong enough to speak for itself. Lily is going to walk into a university someday, soon with her tuition already paid, No strings, no debt, no favors owed to anyone. Desmond is going to keep running that shop with his head held high, knowing that honesty is worth something in this world, even when it's inconvenient. And somewhere out there, my daughter is learning, slowly, the hard way, the same lesson I learned watching my own father come home every night with metal shavings in his cuffs. You take care of your own, but you don't get to decide, all on your own, who's worth taking care of, and who's just in the way.